Most young professionals in the UK right now are grappling with the classic question, rent or buy. And with soaring property prices and high living costs, it's never been a tougher decision. Here's a real life example for you to digest. This 28-year-old software developer from the UK earns £50,000 a year, and she says 2/3 of her income every single month go out on rent. So even with a good salary, this case proves that it's difficult for young people to get on the property ladder. So in this video, we're going to dive into the pros and cons of renting versus buying. Now, spoiler alert, there's no one size fits all. It does depend on your circumstances. So let's get into it. So the first case and the big win for renting is the fact that you are very, very flexible. Unlike when you own your house, you don't have to put your house up for sale when you want to move. So renting gives you added flexibility. Normally contracts with renting are around a year, and then after a year, you can decide whether you'd like to renew your tenancy or whether you'd like to go abroad or go to a different city or go to a different property. It is very, very flexible. And that's something that I personally like about renting. It gives me the flexibility to move around and go where I need to go. Compare that to someone who owns their house. When they think about leaving, they have to then wait for someone to purchase their property off them before they're able to relocate. That can cause all sorts of problems when you find yourself in a chain and you're waiting to sell your property before you go ahead and buy the property from your vendor. Now that can cause massive sticky situations, and I've seen people who have thought they sold their property, then the buyer pulls out at the last minute and they are left with their hopes and dreams shattered. So renting definitely gives you that flexibility, and you're way more flexible being a renter compared to being a homeowner. Another good thing about renting is that there are lower upfront costs. Normally, to secure a rental property, you just need to pay 1 month's rent and then 5 weeks deposit. So generally a few £1,000s. Now compare that to the cost of actually owning a property where you're looking at having a hefty deposit. Most people put down around 10 to 20% of the value of the property as a deposit, so a huge amount, most people's life savings. And then there's other costs like solicitor fees and conveyancing fees, which can add up if you're not careful. And there's the dreaded stamp duty that you have to pay as well. One area that isn't talked about enough in the debate between renting and buying is the fact that when you are renting, it allows you to tie up your capital elsewhere. So a renter could tie up their capital in the stock market or tie up their capital in other income generating assets that allow them to get paid. That is a huge benefit, because I know so many people who bought a property and they become what's called house poor. All of their money is rolled up in that property and they don't have any investments. They are cash poor. Now, if you're a renter and you have all your money tied up in the stock market, renting allows you to keep your money in the stock market, allows it to keep appreciating, and it can, in some instances, give you a better return than if you had your money tied up in a house. So if you're in a rented property, you are not paying for the upkeep of that property. So things like service charges, you're not paying for. If a wall breaks down for whatever reason, or a crack forms, or any structural work is needed, you aren't paying for that. If the washing machine goes, you're not paying for it. If the dishwasher goes, you're not liable for it. If the cooker goes, you're not liable for all these things. So the upkeep is the landlord's responsibility, meaning that you do not have to maintain the property. In the short term, renting can actually give you financial relief as well. So a recent study by Halifax in the Financial Times mentioned that over the short term, renting was actually cheaper than buying a property and owning a property. And that's because of interest rates. Now, interest rates have shot up massively from the 1% that they were around the pandemic time, and it has slowly creeped up year on year. And now people are finding that they're having to shell out hundreds and hundreds of pounds extra to pay their mortgages because the interest rate has gone up, and a lot of people are coming out of their fixed 2 or 5 year term and finding themselves absolutely swamped with these new interest costs. So in the short term, people are actually finding that it is cheaper to rent a property than to buy a property in a comparable area with a mortgage. So that's huge. We've never had a situation in history where that's been the case. Normally, homeowners are paying a lot less a month than renters, but because of interest rates, now we're finding that renters are actually paying less than homeowners who have a mortgage, at least during the beginning of their term. When you're renting a property, you're also insulating yourself from market risk. So something that isn't talked about enough is the fact that when you own a property, you succumb to market risk. So house prices fluctuate all the time. Sometimes they go up and sometimes they go down. There's a common myth that house prices only go up, and that is simply not true. So as a renter, you are insulating yourself from the market risk. A lot of people have bought a property and then have found themselves being in negative equity, which means the house is now worth less than what they paid for it. And they actually owe the bank money more than what the house is worth. So that is somewhere where you'll never find yourself if you're renting a property, because you don't actually own the asset. So you are insulated from the market risk. In a nutshell, renting is best for people who don't know where they want to settle down yet. It's best for people who anticipate moving in a year or two. And it's best for people who have their money tied up in other assets that might be producing more income. And that return that they're getting on those assets may be above and beyond the return that a property could give them. So those are the types of people that would benefit more from renting. Now let's get into the case for owning your property or being a buyer. By far, the biggest benefit of buying a property is the fact that you own the asset and that you're building equity in that property. Every single month you pay the mortgage, you are paying off both interest and capital repayment. for most people who have a capital repayment mortgage. Now that means that you're chipping away at the property, and bit by bit over time you chip away more and more, and eventually you pay off your mortgage and you own the asset. That is something that people renting will never be able to achieve because they don't actually own the asset that they're living in. Whereas when you are a homeowner, you are building equity in your house and you're actually going to own that asset at the end of the day. And your mortgage payments actually go down over time as you own more and more of the house. You're being charged interest on a smaller and smaller percentage. That can be a huge benefit, especially during later years. Because you end up owning the property at the end of your mortgage term and you chip away at that ownership, over the long term, buying a home is actually cheaper than renting a home. Studies showed that over a 50-year period for the average UK house price, buyers spent £429,000, whereas renters in the same type of house spent £623,000. That is nearly a £200,000 lifetime cost in favor of buying versus renting. And as I mentioned, that becomes really apparent in later years because home buyers and homeowners will have virtually no living costs because they're not paying a mortgage, whereas renters will have to pay their rent way into their pensionable age and might be paying that money out of state pension and private pension, which isn't ideal. Another benefit of owning your home is that it gives you stability and security. Now, if you're renting a property, your landlord can kick you out at any time. Yes, they have to give notice, but it's not ideal if you're being kicked out of a property that you see as your home. Whereas when you buy a property, you own it, you're on the deeds. If it's a house, it's a freehold property. That means that you are an owner of the house and no one can kick you out as long as you keep paying the mortgage. So as a homeowner, you have that added level of security and stability. And this can be really important when you think about having children, sending them to school. You know, you don't want to disrupt your children's lives. You don't want to disrupt your lives, especially when you have your career, your job, your friends, etc. Having a home just gives you that level of stability, knowing that no one can kick you out or disrupt your lifestyle. Another benefit of owning a property is that you have fixed rate costs. So you know how much your monthly payments are going to be because they're tied to your mortgage. Whereas when you're renting, your landlord will put your rent up every single year, normally by inflation and sometimes by more. That can massively impact your planning, your budgeting, and your living costs. Because we only earn so much and normally our rate of pay is tracked to inflation. If your landlord starts putting your rent up by more than inflation, you could find yourself in a sticky situation where you could no longer afford to live in your property that you're renting in. Whereas when you're a homeowner, you're much more aware of your mortgage payments and you can budget accordingly. Remember, mortgage payments generally only ever go down, whereas rental payments generally only ever go up. Once you own your property, you are basically living rent-free because you're no longer paying into a mortgage. Whereas if you are renting, you will never be able to live rent-free because you always have to pay the monthly rent on the property that you live in. That is another benefit of being a homeowner over being a renter. Typically, most families in the UK have most of their wealth tied up in their home, and it is a great way to build equity. Historically, house prices have been going up for a number of years now, and people have made a lot of money, especially if you bought your house 20 years ago in certain areas of the country compared to what it is worth today. So house prices going up is a massive scope for appreciation. Now, if you are a renter and you're renting your property, of course, you don't benefit from the appreciation in the house price because your landlord benefits from that. So that is another thing to bear in mind. As a renter, you don't benefit from equity appreciation, capital appreciation, whereas being a homeowner, you do benefit from equity appreciation. The final point, which is often overlooked, is that quality of life can be better if you own your property. And that is because you're able to personalize your house as to your standards. If you're renting a property, then you have to ask the landlord to change certain things. The things like putting paintings on the wall, drilling a hole in the wall, adding a garden hose. Things like this are things that you have to ask your landlord, whereas if you own a property, you can personalize it to your taste. Now that might sound quite light, but when you're creating a family and you're setting yourself up and you want to be in a home that feels cozy, that can be very, very important. It can be important for your mental health and also your quality of life. So don't overlook that. That is a huge, huge point and a huge benefit for people that own their property over people that rent their property. To summarize, buying works best for people who are looking to create a stable home and a stable lifestyle. People that know that they want to stay in a particular area or a property for a number of years. People that want to start families crave stability, so this makes more sense for them. Also, people that want some stability with their monthly spend. If you own a property, you're paying a mortgage out every single month and you know what that figure is. Whereas if you're renting, your rent could potentially go up every single year. So it's getting worse and worse and worse for you, and your living costs could increase rapidly as a result of that. Especially people that don't actually end up getting paid anymore, you could find that squeezing you. Buying a property is also good if you can save up a deposit or you can get some help from grandma or perhaps bank of mum and dad as well. Now, not everyone can have that, but if you do have that and you're lucky enough to benefit from that, then buying a home could be a great idea. Now, there are some further considerations that you have to take into account before deciding whether you want to become a homeowner or whether you want to become a renter. And number one is the financial strain. So buying a property does require a significant amount of capital. Now, for most people, when they buy a property, they're putting their life savings into the property. They are saving up for years and years and years, and a lot of the time getting help from the bank of mum and dad or perhaps grandparents. So it is a big, big commitment. So when you're buying a property, you're committing to that property for a period of time, a long period of time. There's also legal fees, things like stamp duty. There's conveyancing fees, solicitor fees. These things are expensive. So if you're buying a property, it can be very, very expensive. So just be aware and understand that it's a huge outlay of capital. But then there's also the fact that you need to keep up those payments. So if you're a homeowner, you need to pay that mortgage every single month. Now, you need to factor in whether or not your job is stable. Are you going to lose your job? Then you have to factor in whether or not you're going to start a family. That leads to increased living costs. Maternity leave. Do you earn enough to cover both parents? These are things that need to be taken into account. And when you're renting, a lot of the time, you're a lot more flexible, so you don't have to think about these things. So if you do want to buy a property, be aware of this, and you need to plan for years at a time, sort of 5-10 year periods, depending on how long you want to stay in that property. Whereas when you're renting, you don't have that in consideration. You're planning on a year basis. So you can quickly give the keys back to your landlord and say, hey, I don't want to live here anymore. And that house is off your plate. Whereas if you are a homeowner, you cannot do that. When you own a property, you also give up a lot of the flexibility. Let's say, for example, you get a really cool job opportunity to go to Australia and work out there, and it's double your salary right now. Now, if you own a property back here, that is going to keep you tied down because you have to service that mortgage. Yes, you can rent it out, but a lot of people have huge mortgages with huge interest rates, and the rental income would not cover that. So that's a huge thing you need to think about. Whereas if you're renting, you can just give your keys back at the end of your tenancy, pop over to Australia and start your new life out there. That is something that you need to consider. You need to think about where your life's going to be in the next few years and how flexible you need to be. That will decide whether you want to be a homeowner or if you want to rent for the foreseeable future. Next is the ongoing costs and maintenance when it comes to owning a property. So as I mentioned before, owning a property means you have to deal with all of the problems that property has. If your washing machine goes, you have to replace it. If your dishwasher goes, you have to replace it. If there's structural damage or damp, then you have to pay for that and you have to fix it. If the roof has damage, you have to get a new roof. You have to replace tiles. That is all on you as the homeowner. Whereas when you're renting, you can simply just phone up your landlord and say, hey, I have a problem, and your landlord has to fix that. That is their obligation. So bear that in mind, there are maintenance costs when it comes to owning a property. Another point worth considering is the fact that when you are renting a property, you are essentially throwing away dead money because you're not building equity in the property. All you are doing is benefiting from the property and the location that it's in and the ease and convenience of that. You don't have any stake in the property. You don't benefit from the capital appreciation. You don't benefit from anything with the property. You simply live in it for the set period of time of which your tenancy is. So bear that in mind. Renting for too long can mean throwing away money and it being dead money because you're literally just paying to live in a house and you're not benefiting from the capital appreciation. Whereas owning a property, you benefit from that capital appreciation. So when that house does go up in value, you benefit from it and you are making money from it. Whereas you can rent somewhere for 5 years and you come out of that with no equity, no money that you can roll into a future purchase, and you have to start from scratch. Renting also gives you high levels of uncertainty. So recently in the UK, because landlords are having increased pressure, a lot of them are selling up their rental properties and moving that money into things like an ISA or a SIP. Now, if you're a lifetime renter or a long-term renter, that can mean a complete upheaval for you and your family, and you then have to find new accommodation, whereas as an owner, you don't have those same problems. Another point is the fact of inflation. So the rental market tends to be hit harder when it comes to inflation, and rents typically rise around 10% every single year. Now, of course, with mortgages, your mortgage is not going to rise 10% every single year because you're insulated because you own the property. So bear that in mind, if you are a long-term renter, it could actually be better for you in the long term to buy a property as opposed to rent a property. When it comes to the debate between renting and buying, your personal circumstances are key. For example, if you have an unstable income and you don't have enough deposit saved up, renting is probably the more viable option. Whereas if you're flush with cash and you've got deposit money saved up and you plan to stay in that area or that property for years to come, it could make more sense for you to buy that property and benefit from the equity and capital appreciation, plus the fact that you know what's going out every single month in mortgage payments. Now, a lot of people watching this are going to find themselves somewhere in between renting and buying. So if you do need to rent for a few years before you're in a position to buy, that's completely fine as well. But it's also okay to prioritize your stability if you know you're someone who prefers to know exactly what's going out every single month and prefers the stability of owning their property. There really is no right or wrong answer. The rent versus buy debate isn't about finding a winner because there's no one size fits all, and it really depends on where you are right now in your life. Both routes have their main merits. So renting gives you short-term affordability. You don't have to put up buckets of cash for the deposit, and you have flexibility, meaning that if your lifestyle does change, you can just pivot and move away. Whereas buying offers you a long-term asset. You get equity appreciation, stability, and a place to call home. Think about your life situation and where you are right now. If you're in between and can't decide whether you want to rent or buy, Think about how much money you have right now. Do you need to invest? Do you need to save? What is your money doing right now? Do you have it tied up in the stock market? Is it providing you more capital appreciation than maybe a house could do? All of these things need to be taken into consideration before you decide whether you want to be a renter or a buyer. Now, there are rent versus buy calculators out there that can extrapolate data over a long period of time. So it might be worth crunching the numbers to decide which option might be better for you right now. Circumstances do change. And remember that renting right now doesn't mean that you'll be renting forever. A lot of people rent to find out whether or not they like an area. They might or they might not, and a lot of people will rent for a little bit and continue to save until they're in a position where they can actually buy a property. And I know some people who have rented in a HMO or a house of multiple occupants, paid a few £100s every single month, and then saved up enough to then buy a property or end up meeting someone and then saving enough deposit between them to go ahead and buy a property. So everyone's circumstances are different and there is no one-size-fits-all policy. Don't be swayed by anyone calling renting, throwing away dead money, and pushing you towards buying a property. I know so many people who are house poor, meaning that the house is the only asset that they have, and they have no money, meaning that their quality of life isn't great. You don't want to be in that position. You want to buy a property when it's the right time for you. The rent versus buy decision comes down to your personal goals, what you want to achieve, how much you crave stability versus what your money is doing in other areas. Assess your circumstances honestly and decide what the right path for you is. Think about what you value and think about where your life's going to be in the next few years. Ultimately, you know what's best, and only you can make the right decision for yourself given your circumstances.
Want to learn more? Check out this video where I go through how you can transfer your money from a workplace pension into a SIP and potentially make even more gains.